Okay, welcome to this latest edition of the Machine Sessions, and my guest today is my old mucker, Martin Shaw. Many of you probably watching this will know Martin already, but for those of you who don't, Martin is a mythologist, a writer, a storyteller. Currently, he's in residence at the Faculty of Divinity at Cambridge. He's previously been a visiting professor at Stanford. He's the author of so many books I've lost count, but the new book that he has coming out with Penguin, same publisher as me, in fact, is going to be called Liturgies of the Wild, The Myths That Make Us, and that is out next February 2026. So, Martin, welcome. Hello. How are you doing?
Hello, my friend. Good to see you. This is never my favorite bit of the year, summer. I'm not really designed for summer. I'm designed for autumn, a little bit of spring, and a long winter in some Nordic location. So by now, we're into, people don't like it when I say this. I always feel like we're into the kind of dog end of a British summer, kind of moseying into August. None of your friends are available. Everybody's disappeared. And anything for me really interesting is happening in September. So I am. James Hillman once said to me, the psychologist, he said it's always good to let yourself decompose once in a while. Interesting idea. And so this is August is usually my month of decomposition where I just sort of rot a bit and then spring back to life like a character called Bagpuss.
British readers of our generation will remember
Yes.
Bagpuss well. Yeah, I think January is usually my decomposition month, actually. January or
Mm.
February. I just like to sit by the fire and try not to move at all. Um,
Yes. Well, it's a nice fire you have. I've sat next to it many times and drunk some of your poutine on
well,
occasion
yeah, no.
with your lovely wife, your lovely children. Sometimes your son plays his guitar.
He does. He
How's
does.
he doing? Is he all right?
He's doing very well, actually. In fact, one of our friends has just given him a bass guitar, which he's
Oh,
wanted for ages. And a friend of ours had one sitting in his loft, and he said, "Would you like this?" So he's currently in his room with the curtains closed, like a teenager playing the bass guitar. So he's having a good time.
perfect.
So, Martin, let me tell people about you, and let me ask you to tell us about yourself. So, as I said at the beginning of this, Martin is a mythologist, which is not a way that many people get to be introduced in the world these days. And when did we first meet, Martin? 15 years ago, perhaps, something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. It's a good
And
stretch of time.
I was running the Dark Mountain project at the time, and somebody, I can't remember who, said to me, "Look, you really need to meet this guy, Martin Shaw. He's a storyteller, and he ought to come and tell stories at your festival." Now, you know as well as I do, Martin, that when you hear the word storyteller, sometimes a kind of a shiver goes down your spine. You think, what does that mean? This could be good or awful. But for some reason, we elected to meet in the village of Lostwithiel in Cornwall. I think it was your suggestion. And it was must have been a winter night because I remember it being very misty. And we were going to meet in a pub, a thatched pub. And our first meeting was, to me, it was a very mythological scene, actually. So there was this thatched pub on a hill on the left-hand side of the road, and there was mist everywhere, and the mist was just illuminated by street lights. And I was walking down the hill towards this pub, and there was just one figure in the street walking up towards me with a hat on. And this figure comes up towards me, and of course, we didn't know what each other looked like. And I walk down the hill, he walks up the hill, and he points a ghostly finger at me through the mist, and he says, "Is it you?" And I still haven't been able to answer that question, but I still don't know. It's a very Zen question. Anyway, we went to the pub and we had a few pints, and strangely enough, we've been working together ever since, and our
Mm.
paths have crossed in many different ways. I've We've taught together in New York City, and we've driven to the Tower of Robinson Jeffers, and I've watched you telling stories in the Tower of W.B. Yeats, and we've talked.
Yes.
I've been on one of your 4 day wilderness vigils on Dartmoor,
Yeah.
which you might want to
Yeah.
talk about as well. So you need to tell us a bit about how you got here. So there's a story you tell in your first book about how, as a young man, you were in a band. You were a drummer in a band, and this band was pretty successful, and you had a contract with a major label. It all looked like it was taking off. And then something happened which made you give back this contract and walk away and end up living in a tent on a series of hills in England for four
Yeah.
years. So what was it that happened there, and how did that lead you to where you are now?
Wow. Well, I mean, I'll do my best to work with the notion of compression because that is such an
Yeah, I
enormous
know it's your life
question.
story. Sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. We're going back so far now. I was about 23. So we're going back we're going back 30 years.
Mm.
And yes, it's true. I was a musician living in London. I was living in a men's hostel, kind of going through a pretty. I think most divorces are ugly, and I was going through one at an incredibly young age. And I had heard through a friend of mine that there was this thing that people did occasionally. He told me in one of these old red phone boxes that we used to have in England. He said, "Do you want to do something that's going to change your life?" And I, like a fool, said, "Of course, as you do when you're 23." He said, "Well, I'm going to sit on a Welsh hill for 4 days and nights and see what happens." And of course, it just sounded the most irresistible thing to me in the world until, of course, you actually get to Snowdonia and night falls and the primordial fears that are in everybody floats to the surface where you're no longer thinking about ticks and being hungry. You're thinking about the other world and all sorts of mystical things that can happen once you begin to move out of the jurisdiction of domestic life. And so I sat and I sat and I sat for 4 days and nights. And the last night of this process, as you know well, involves sitting up all night. It's the final. So you're fasting, you're not in a tent, you are under a little bit of tarpaulin, you have no fire, you're dry, but that's about it. And in the middle of the last night of this experience, not even really in the middle, it was the whole of the night. I had a sort of protracted mystical encounter. And I had absolutely no vocabulary for that at the time because although I grew up in a profoundly Christian house, I had very consciously walked away from that. So I didn't really have a handle on what was happening to me other than when in the morning the sun rose, it was a completely different world that I was looking at. And that encounter gave me the gumption, as you say, to go back to Warner Brothers, Warner Chappell, actually, the publishers, returned the contract that I had with them, which was for 3 albums with a small band, and leave. And you and many of the people watching this will remember in the previous century, you could really leave. You could just disappear. Friendships, people just went missing. They weren't ill. You just never heard from them again. And so I ended up, believe it or not, spending 4 years, as you say, living in a tent on a succession of English hills, trying to put together quite what had happened to me out there and quite what that meant in terms of my relationship to a particular landscape, the British landscape. Where myth comes in is that I began slowly to read the stories that you and I and many others loved when we were kids. I started to read stories about King Arthur. I started to read about Robin Hood. I started to read folk and fairy tales. And I realized that embedded within these stories were accounts of sort of trial, quest, the strangeness of the natural world, the notion of a creator, all the things that I was wrestling with. There was already a very elegant way of talking about it, which was myth. Because every time I tried to talk about what I was going through, and I was using a lot of personal narrative and a lot of, I statement, the energy of it sort of diminished. And if I didn't watch out, it was the kind of thing I was going to talk about in the kitchen at parties and people gradually leave. So, so that was the thing. I had a big, raw, strange encounter on a Welsh hill, and then began the process of trying to piece that together. And the language, the oldest technology I had to do that was myth and story.
So when I hear you tell these stories and talk about that, it's almost as if the place itself was giving you something.
Yes.
It's like the hill you're in has something it needs you to do or something it wants to tell you. It's like the place itself in some ways community, which is it's a very old idea, right? It's a very indigenous idea. You get it in cultures around the world. And when I hear you talk about your experiences, that often seems to be what's happening somehow. Do you think there's something to that?
I do. As I'm talking to you, I'm thinking about the conversations I had with my parents about it. Because when you come out of a wilderness vigil, one of the things you're recommended to do is to not talk volubly about it for a year. So I had a year where I had to make all these rather radical life decisions and remain almost mute about why I was doing it. And I talked to my parents. I remember going on a long walk, as I often do with my dad, and I said, "Look, Dad, I sat on this Welsh hillside And it would appear that the landscape of not just Britain but South Dakota and Amazonia and out in the Badlands of Australia are filled with what my father would refer to as Elohim, like little messengers or fairies or spirits. And I was now, they were, believe it or not, they were sort of in full display to me for a period of time without any use of, visionary vines or mushroom, nothing like that at all, just sitting still. And I remember my dad saying to me, he said, well, there are some things the Bible just doesn't talk about much. There are strange hints in Genesis, but what I have to say, I think, because I know how peculiar that may sound to people, and I've already gone so far out where the buses don't park, people aren't going to go there with me, and that's fair enough. But what I can say is none of these sort of spiritual presences ever seemed malevolent. They just seemed otherly. They just seemed very different. And they seem to have been here for an extraordinarily long amount of time. Now, by the time you and I met, I was fairly well versed in that experience. That was already, getting on for 2 dozen years ago. But never once did those experiences put me in a kind of worshipful frame of mind. So I was never trying to say, oh, so we all need to go to the woods and worship the mountain or worship the river or worship the denizens of that place. What I was aware of was the earth and specifically the wilderness does seem to communicate with us in all sorts of ways and have presences in it that, we a modicum of respect would be a good idea. It was a lot to handle actually as a kid. It was a lot I don't think I was much fun to be around for about 8 years afterwards. I just didn't know what to do with it. I'm sure I became very theatrical. uh
Well, you're dealing with something which is very, very ancient and very common in almost every indigenous tradition, but completely alien to this strange kind of anti-culture that we built for
yeah,
ourselves, which when people hear this kind of talk, they assume that you need to be sectioned. So
yeah,
you have to, it seems to me you've spent your life trying to work out how to talk about this
yes,
in a
yeah,
way that
that
would have been completely clear to, as I say, to most traditional cultures, but is almost impossible for people to speak about today, even though, funnily enough, a lot of people have similar experiences, but they're not allowed to speak about them or they don't feel that they can.
I was very blessed, and the first of my really significant teachers arrived about 2 years after that in the shape of a Lakota Sioux medicine man called Wallace Black Elk. Black Elk's grandfather wrote Black Elk Speaks, which is the prophetic account of the Lakota Sioux. And just to really twist people's heads, he was a Catholic.
Indeed.
So there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on with the Black Elk line. And it was Black Elk really that said, no, you're not crazy. And if you were in a culture worthy of the name, in a very non-hysterical way, we'd be able to decipher what has happened to you and there'd be a way through it. And what he briefly suggested was what led to what actually happened. He said, well, he said, sometimes people come back. And this isn't, I really, really want to emphasize at this moment, this wasn't a heroic moment in my life. There wasn't a light shining on my head and he was telling me I was special. It wasn't like that. He just said, well, you could spend a bit of time with me back in South Dakota, but that process eventually is going to turn you into a strange kind of white Lakota person. Or, or you can go out and find out what that experience has to say to you in what he would call the bush. And I elected to do that. I knew within about an hour of him saying it, it could go one way or the other. But importantly for me, Wallace, as you said, had an easily decipherable take on it that he was able to give me. And that was something that I clung on to and trusted for many years.
And it's interesting because I've felt all my life that I was chatting recently to Ian McGilchrist in this series, and
Mm.
we were having a very good conversation about his all the work he's done on the right and the left hemisphere of the brains and the different ways that they see things and the less left hemispheric way of seeing that is very good at seeing the parts and the right is very good at seeing the whole. And obviously we're a very left hemisphere society if you want to look at it like that. And that leads to a culture that has completely lost touch with its stories. And it's very interesting that you get that choice from Wallace Black Elk. It's like you can come here and you can learn from us, but you end up being alienated from your place, or you can go home and you can try and learn in your place, but it's presumably harder because there's no language there for you to do that.
Yes, there's no village in
There's
it.
no
In
village because
there's no
we've lost
village.
touch with all of our stories and all of our sense of indigeneity and place and nature, just what the earth is actually saying to us at any given place.
Yes, I mean the place I had to return to after that initial experience was Southeast London.
Mm.
And I wasn't really privy to people like William Blake at the time. And to be fair, William Blake's London was not at all like the kind of London that I was in. It was
Now it's
sort of
changed totally.
almost a rural idyll.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so actually, I had to make use of small parks and little places and understand actually. So, for example, in the Bardic or the Druidic tradition, if they were looking to go out into nature and read or decipher a situation that was in their mind, they wouldn't gaze out at 100,000 cormorants and 52 mountains and seven rivers. They would bring their gaze to 1 square foot of earth and just look and look and look. And at some point in that small, formalized, compressed thing, and information would arrive. So I decided not to be sizist about the wild. And if I could find a rowan tree, fair enough, that was enough. But in the end, I was compelled enough to leave everything. I remember leaving London with £16, which even then was not a lot of money. And £16 and a note and an address. And that's how all that began.
So what did these 4 years you spend in a tent in these different places,
Yes.
what's the main thing that teaches you, you think? I mean, maybe that's a difficult question to answer, but what was different about the person who came back?
It's funny, I reflect on it now and I think if I had my time again, if I did it again, what would be different? Knowing, as an older fella, what would I do differently? And I would have gone further. I would have gone further. I would have gone, I would have understood more consciously what I was doing. Whereas as we do when we're younger, we just chuck things about and see what happens. And it was a little bit of that. It was a very romantic thing to do. I thought it would just be a beautiful way to live. So who came out the other end? Well, Shanachie came out the other end. A storyteller came out the other end.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is, for me, is it. I was listening to the introduction that you very kindly gave me, and we both have them. We both have interesting little biographies. But the truth is, into my dotage from now on, I just need to confess what I really am, which is a sort of fairly ordinary West Country mystic. That's it. That's
Mm.
it. And everything else is a response to that little bit of ground that I'm really engaged with. I'm a person with a postcode. I
Mm.
come from a particular place. It's been formed by a particular kind of landscape. I'm not very good as a pundit. I'm not very good on talking about everything that is happening in other parts of the world. I'm reminded as I say that of somebody that we've both read a lot, John Moriarty. Now, Moriarty's interesting in all sorts of ways, but when he talks about Kerry, I feel that there's another kind of authority in his work. And so, one of the things I suppose I was trying to find out when I came out of the tent was how do I become a real human being? That was the main question. I felt the first human I'd ever met was Wallace Black Elk. How do I become a human being? How does corn grow on my tongue? That was one of Wallace's questions for me. How do you speak beautifully in a world that is designed to put you into a trance state? How do you break trance states and live in a way, as Bly would say, that is not just life preserving, but life giving? How do you do that? So I came out the other end of that with all sorts of questions. By now, I'd done many fasts. I'd spent thousands of nights out in the wild. And the most interesting thing for my personal growth is what happened next. I became a dad. I became a
Well,
dad.
that'll grow you up. pretty
That'll
quick.
grow you up in a very, very different type of way. And
Yeah.
suddenly there was a beautiful little being in the world to look after, and the indignity of what they would call ordinary time. You know, it wasn't always liminal. It was ordinary time. And
Mm.
how can the ordinary time? I had six jobs, you know, when Dulcie was a kid. I had all these different jobs, and they all brought in. I was working £6 an hour. You know, it was gritty.
Mm. So you mentioned Bly, Robert Bly,
Yeah,
who I talk about a little bit in my book, Against the Machine. There's a chapter in which I talk specifically about his book, The Sibling Society, which I think you recommended to me, actually. That's where I
I
ended up reading
did,
it.
and
And sorry, go on.
I think the Sibling Society is a sort of grandparent of Against the Machine.
Mm.
Uh, Now, the advice I would have to give you is knowing Robert as I did, it took a toll on his personal health writing that
Mm.
book. It gave him, I'm pretty sure it gave him an ulcer. And afterwards, he never went back to that kind of. He did the thing, he did the book he had to do, but he was a bit like actually, it's a bit like the experience of Ted Hughes writing Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being, which
Mm.
was his really, really big book on Shakespeare. He's like, I've done it, I'm never doing it again.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
I can completely appreciate
yeah,
that. Yeah.
Ted Hughes got shingles.
Mm.
He got shingles.
Well,
Uh,
that kind of writing takes it out of you. I mean, that book is interesting, The Sibling Society, because it's about 20 or 30 years ahead of its time.
yeah,
Actually, I think Iron John, his more famous book, he is as well in a different way.
yeah,
But The Sibling Society is really talking about it. What struck me about that most is he talks about the West and America in particular as a society that's colonized itself, that's effectively eaten itself from within,
yeah,
has forgotten all of its stories and rejected its grandparents and rejected its teachers and its past and the rest of it. And it sounds like, from a certain perspective, that could be a typical conservative story, but it's not in that political sense or cultural sense at all. It's much more akin to what you're talking about. You heard what you heard from Wallace Black Elk. It seems to me. You know, there's if you lose touch with the stories that made you and the place that made you, then you're adrift. And that's basically what Bly was predicting in about 1995, and it seems like that's where we've got to. I've spent a lot of this book trying to work out what that actually means and where it's come from and what we should do with it. And your work is important because there's something very rooted about it. There's something very rooted about it in the best sense of the word, that it comes from something that's much more eternal. I remember when I first heard you tell a story, this was at one of our Dark Mountain festivals after our meeting in a pub, and along you came, and I thought, well, I wonder what this guy can do. And when you told us that, when you told the story, and I can't remember which one it was now, um, it felt like something living came into the room. And I always feel that when I hear you tell a story, and you know, the phrase telling a story is inadequate to talk about what happens, because this is feels like the summoning of something. And as you would point out, this isn't really about you, although you have got the skills to do it. There's something alive that you've worked out how to bring into the place.
mm,
And when you experience it, you realize what you're missing, you know, as a culture and as a person. I don't know if you felt that the first time you had it, but there's something that
mm,
you've learnt to do, which is almost completely extinct where we are now, and possibly less extinct here in Ireland, actually, with the likes
yeah,
of Moriarty, but still very
mm,
much on the verge of disappearing. And it's
yes.
only when you experience it that you think, "Oh God, I really needed that." You know?
Yes. As you're saying that, I'm thinking of the roots of the word culture, coller, which means to dig. So as you're talking about rooted and you're talking about place and you're talking about story, it's true. An old woman quite a few years back to me now, she said to me, it was an old native woman in the States, she said, story is a word to describe a cloak. She was referring to me particularly. She said, story is a word to describe a cloak that you throw over a room of people to do something else with. And it's a very old, old thing. And I don't even know how you figured it out. I just don't know how you figured this out. I know that from that first time in the mountains of Snowdonia, I was never, ever the same when I came down. And I've had access to something ever since.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because as we both have had fairly public, I suppose I loathe the phrase, but conversions to
Yeah,
Christianity.
I don't like that word either.
It's not right. It's
I
not
know
the
it isn't.
right
It might be
word.
something. No, it's more
But
like an unveiling.
people sort of wondered they wondered if I'd sort of go up in smoke, or I would be sort of struck dumb or unable to tell many of the stories I told before. Now, just to flag up, I'm not somebody that just says everything is God, everything's leading up the mountain, all is well, put it together. I cannot bear a la carte religion of any kind,
Mm.
especially not a la carte Christianity. But I would say a lot of the stories that you and I respond to, and I think many people respond to, missing stories, have kind of pinpricks of grace in them. I just believe that. I think often they have fundamental Christian values in them. And then you get this extraordinary thing that happens 2,000 years ago that we've been living in the after effects of ever since. But anyway, sorry, I'm running away with myself.
No, no, this is really interesting because what happened to you, speaking of, it's almost like these two ends of your life are dovetailed by these two huge mystical experiences that you have, right? So you go up on the hill
Mm,
and in your 20s and something happens that you spend 20 years working out. And all this time, as you say, you know, you come from a Christian family, your father's a preacher, your brother is as well, you know, and you reject that, you walk away, and then later in your life, not so long ago, um, very similar time to when the same sort of thing was happening to me, along comes another giant mystical experience in the wild, and this one, to your horror, appears to be a Christian experience. It appears to
yeah.
be taking you back
Wow.
home to the place you didn't even realize was your home.
They are bookends. They
Mm.
are bookends. You're exactly right. And I've slowly, I'm not always the sharpest pencil in the pack, especially when it comes to my own life. I've slowly realized this was the case, and a few people have kind of cottoned on to it. But yes, 5 years, no, yes, 5 years ago now, it was the very, very beginning of 2020. I was coming to the end of this 101-day vigil in a Dartmoor forest and had this equally profound encounter that has provided it's proved a lot more sort of cohesive and long lasting than the first one. The first one, in a way, is a kind of explosion of things. This has never occurred to me before. It's an explosion, but what happened 5 years ago was the putting together of something. It was to do with wholeness, not fracture. And like you, I think it took me a minute to catch up with what on earth was going on. You know, I just, I was frightened. I think in a way, I was kind of, I just never saw this on the cards.
No, no, I think if you told either of us 5 or 6 years ago that we would be
You,
chatting away as
you
Orthodox Christians, it would have been
No, you and I,
completely.
you and I, you mentioned we went on a road trip. This
Hmm.
was 8 years ago, 9 years
Yeah, it would
ago.
have been, yeah.
Beast had come out, your book, Scatterlings, my book had come out, and we drove. To be fair, you drove. I just sat and looked out the
Yeah, I
window.
take the credit. I take the
Yeah,
credit.
you're very brave to be chucked in all these, these foreign countries and the roads and everything.
I like a challenge.
Yes, you do. So we were driving around though, and the notion you were actually finishing Dark Mountain. The last Dark Mountain event in a way was at Robinson Jeffers Place,
It was, yeah.
and I was about to start an MA. Actually, I was about to lead an MA in myth and ecology, so I was going back into the academy in England. You were leaving it. It was a moment of tremendous possibility that then leads actually fairly quickly for you, or maybe it's happened before. It's all around the period that you write Savage Gods.
Yeah, that happened fairly soon after that, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
that was the beginning of thing. Well, but again, talking about picturing piecing your own life back together in
Yeah,
retrospect. Savage Gods is a basically a spiritual breakdown, which
yeah,
which then leads to exactly the same kind of strange, unexpected Christian piecing together of things that you're talking about in a different way. And so we both end up. I felt exactly the same as well, having explored so much and done so many things in different ways to you in my life that spiritually anyway, and still not really being sure what was going on that what happened to me with my kind of Christian revelation exactly does the same thing. It puts things back in the shape they were supposed to be. It says, oh, you know, all the stuff you've been looking at from different angles, this is what it looks like if you look at it in full. And it's the one, I think it was Moriarty who said it was the only prayer that was big enough to hold everything that was real, the only story that was big enough. which is a curious truth. So to go back to stories though, there's something significant. I mean, actually, talking about Savage Gods, this is one of the other themes of that book. Savage Gods is a book that firstly talks about place and kind of exile, but also talks about words and the limits of words. And I talk a lot in that book about partly drawing on the work of our mutual friend David Abram and others about the move from oral to written culture and the way that that changes everything about the way we see the world. And sometimes it seems that you've kind of walked in from an oral society into this written society,
Mm.
and words are a technology that's very much part of, I suppose, what I end up calling the machine, a society which ends up being so radically utilitarian and left brain and technological that it can do lots of stuff. It can make incredible machines. It can achieve all sorts of technological wonders, but something about its soul has withered away because it cannot see something that the older societies could see very, very clearly. And you still seem to be somehow carrying around with you. It feels like you brought it in from
Y-
some old
Yeah,
world, some teepee of the past.
yes, and I think there've been times where I felt so profoundly misunderstood with that.
I
It's
know the
been
feeling.
extremely painful,
Yeah, I can
and
imagine.
it's been a cross, and it's been like, oh, take this from my back, please, because when I waltz into the Hay on Wye Literary Festival as an author,
Mm.
200 people come out and I sign lots of books. Everybody contextualizes me instantaneously. But the moment people get a sense of the orality and the way my mind is actually working, and actually, in truth, the things that I really care about, I'm far more interested in prehistoric Jesus than I am empirical Jesus. I'm
Mm.
far more interested in the Jesus of the Lascaux caves than I am, well, don't you see the wonderful things he did in how we made Europe? I'm like, oh, not
Yeah,
again.
yeah, yes.
Can we
History of
please
civilization.
loosen this
Wonderful.
up a bit? So I do feel as I get older, I take more seriously the nuance of what you're pulling at, which is actually a custodian of something you don't want to be in a hurry to get rid of. You
No,
don't want to be a hurry because actually it could be extinguished very quickly
yeah, and I've always
and
seen you
is.
like that actually. I've always seen you as somebody who's come carrying something very delicate. And like you say, if you present yourself as a writer, people think they know what that means. And that's a kind of that's a sort of establishment way to tell stories. That's fine. It's
Mm.
all good to be a writer, but you're doing something different. I mean, you are a writer, but you're using it to carry something different. It's interesting when you talk about explaining yourself because part of the reason I ended up writing this enormous book that I'm now promoting is that I've been carrying all these ideas around on my shoulders for 30 years, and
Yes, you have.
I wanted to get them down in a final form and say, okay, this is what I think. You and I both know what it's like to be misunderstood and misrepresented. That certainly hasn't happened to me. Not that that's the incentive for writing the book, but you want to be able to say as well as you can, okay, this is what I mean. And you'll still be misunderstood a bit, but when you're trying to carry something that's a little bit outside the norm, it's much harder to do that. And
Do
especially
you?
when you're bringing it from a very much older way of seeing, which you certainly are.
So my question, having not read Against the Machine yet, what is I would imagine most of us are au fait with the McGilchrist idea of left and right.
Hmm.
Where does it inhabit between those two zones?
Well, that's the question. What you mean in terms of the book itself and the way
Yeah,
it
in terms of
interacts?
reading it.
Well, I'd like to think that, as is McGilchrist's ideal, that the left hemisphere is in service to the right. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do. It's a book of stories, ultimately. I find that I can't tell the story of the machine and what it is without telling stories from history, without explaining what this is. It's certainly not a theoretical book because I can't stand theoretical books. I can't read them or write them. I have to tell stories. So, what I'm trying to do is get to the heart of a question I had when I was about 10 years old, which is what's wrong with this world? Why, when I look out at it, do I not feel comfortable in it? Is this just me or is there something wrong? There seems to be something missing. There seem to be a bunch of experiences I'm having, especially in nature. Because, like you, I used to do a lot of long walks with my dad, spent weeks camping up on mountains, had a lot of profound, very Wordsworthian experiences that couldn't be explained, that were easily dismissed as romantic or nostalgic or the usual words. There was something, and there still is something, that the values of the culture I live in was profoundly missing. And it's about those relationships to nature and those relationships to each other, the way that other cultures knew something that we don't. And I wanted to know what that was. And really, this notion of a machine, that we've actually managed to create a society which is highly technological, highly rational, highly utilitarian, very effective at doing those things. But in doing so, we've actually bulldozed a great area of our sensibility into oblivion, because we're effectively told that if we can't measure it, then it isn't real. And
Yeah.
that's the real thing. And I'm trying to say repeatedly, I mean, this is what I've done in every single book I've ever written, whether I've tried to or not. You know, those things that you can't measure, but they're real. You know, here's why they're real. Here's what they are. And it's difficult to find words for them. You know this. You know, you're trying to point to something that actually people can feel in their heart. But
Yes, they can.
society very often tells them that it's not a legitimate way of seeing, you know?
I think a word that is hugely useful that has gone out of fashion, but I think is really pertinent to your inquiry is the word soul.
Mm,
And I've been asking people recently about things. I've been saying, wouldn't it be interesting if, and this is not an original idea, but it's an idea that I like, wouldn't it be interesting if rather than saying, is this thing effective, you asked, is it soulful?
mm,
Is this the most soulful, interesting, creative, beautiful way I can approach this particular issue? And if it isn't, if it's just about the fast track, if it's just about desire over longing, which is a big part of me with the machine, I think the machine is designed really to cater for our desires incredibly quickly in the vain hope that we forget what we actually long for. And
mm,
what we actually long for is God.
mm,
And so the machine is doing everything it can with all the bells and the whistles to distract us from what Yeats would call the deep heart's core. And for me, what actually is essential about being a human being. So it is it's a very dangerous thing. And I think, unfortunately, I felt that I was growing up in the West with a religion that had one hand tied behind its back, because it was frantically extroverted. It didn't seem to have a contemplative backbone anymore. It didn't seem to have a great perception of mystery. It ironically, it was a religion that was still talking to the wrong part of my head. It was a sermon based experience, not a liturgically based experience. And actually, in the world I was in, forgive me, all my evangelical friends, as I say this, there were two areas that it really honed in on. One was extremely solid nuts and bolts sermons that had clearly were the highlight of the morning. But right next to that was really full on charismatic experiences where people are rolling around and speaking in tongues. So you had extreme emotion delivered in the kind of praise and worship section. And then you had, and here's your 3 points to take home and think about for the next week. But all of these were, as I said, for me, I have to keep using this word, extroverted displays of parts of my head. But the deep interior, candidly, was only being met by myth and story. When we would walk home from church together with the pressure off, my dad would tell me fairy tales, having no idea what he was sprinkling into my young consciousness at the time.
yeah, they
Or
understand
maybe,
really fast.
because I'd say to him, come on, Dad, this is surely where the action is. I'm hanging on a thread when you start telling me stories in the forest.
Well, it's interesting that he was telling you those, that he'd learned them and stored them up and had some need to tell them.
My dad, who I still has, he's only like 19 years older than I am, so he's still very sprightly. Now, my dad, I owe an enormous legacy of imagination, ideas, and romanticism to both him and my mum and my family. And he was very young himself, actually, when he was transmitting these stories to me. And he was in training for the ministry. He was going to be a he was going to be a vicar, I suppose, in the end, or a pastor would be the word. But he had this irrepressible, tricksterish love of stories. This is an interesting thing. I was talking to an Orthodox priest the other day, and we were talking about fairy tales. I was telling a fairy tale, And even though one of the characters goes to hell to rescue 3 strands of hair from the head of the devil, we both agreed that the devil in this story absolutely positively is not the same devil that we are referring to in biblical or scriptural terms. It's absolutely not. These are trickster figures. And usually, rather a bit like Baba Yaga, if you can make it through the other end, you've learnt something.
Mm.
Well, I would always say it's death in service to life rather than death in service to death. When you mean death in service to death, you've met an antichrist energy.
Mm.
But I think the Christianity that I was around had no shadows in it. It was strip lit. As I said, it was not mysterious, and it didn't deal with the kind of turbulent darkness that teenagers have. They do. You can raise your kids. I have examples of this in my own family. You can raise your kids with no smartphones around. You can raise them far, far away from anything that isn't ostensibly Christian and religious. But I guarantee you, there's a kind of correct turbulence that arrives in
Mm.
adolescence
Oh yeah.
that needs a place for it. And if you only have, very clean, crystallized images, it's very hard. I mean, my big question as a Christian is how do I follow a figure entirely of light?
Mm.
How on earth do I do that? Because that doesn't feel real to me.
Well, Jesus is, I mean, he is a figure entirely of light in the sense that he's without sin, but at the same time, he's not an easy, clean-cut figure.
No.
No, he's not the Prince of Peace that I always used to get taught about at school, which I think is one of the most ludicrous slogans. I mean, he is clearly radically peaceful in many ways, but he's deeply complex. I
Oh
remember when
yeah.
I first became a Christian again, and I should say again because I never was. That's probably a Freudian slip. I became a Christian and I sat down and I said, well, I think I need to read the Gospels because I'd read them before as a kind of historical inquiry when I was a student or something. But I thought, well, I'm going to read them as if they were true. And I read Matthew and I thought, I don't remember this guy at all. I don't recognize this Jesus from anywhere. And there's something, his personality just comes powerfully out in every line, but he's not an easy character.
No,
He's an easy
no.
man to be around, and he's not giving any quarter either. It's a kind of radical, dangerous love that he's projecting.
It's absolutely astonishing. I was we don't have the space to go into it today, but the talk you gave in New York a few months ago, for me that was just like straightforward Christian information.
Well, that's what
I
I thought.
I couldn't believe. It's like, has anybody actually
Yeah,
picked this book up in the last 100 years and had a look at the fella?
I thought it
Let
was
me
fairly
just
straightforward, but
just so we're clear,
mm,
Jesus Christ is a scandal. He's a
mm.
scandal from the moment he's born to the moment he has the audacity to return from his own death.
Yes, indeed.
Uh,
Yeah.
he's a fugitive. He's an outlaw. He's an exorcist. He's a storyteller. He's a miracle maker, and he cannot be drawn with one line, which is what you said. For certain groups, he's not ascetic enough. We get John the Baptist writing to him in prison or sending a message saying, "Are you really who you say you are?"
Mm,
Everything about him is troubling. He's working under a terrific amount of pressure. He is quite thin skinned on occasion. And yes, as many people have written, he does have a sense of humor, but it's quite a strange one.
mm.
So, like you, how on earth we pulled the stinger out of someone this, for me, perpetually spiritually unruly?
Mm.
I have no idea.
And you
So,
mentioned
like you, what I thought I knew, I didn't know.
you mentioned Nicholas Black Elk earlier,
Mm.
and that talk I gave in New York, which was called "Against Christian Civilization," just to really poke at the bear. I started that talk by quoting Ohiesa, who was another Native American who was also a Christian. Also, I don't know if he became a Catholic or I can't remember what kind of Christian he was, but he became a minister as well, and he spent a lot of his time trying to teach his people about Christ. And it was him who came up with this killer phrase that Christianity and Western civilization are opposed and irreconcilable. Modern civilization, I think he said. But he could see, despite coming from an indigenous Native American background, just as Nicholas Black Elk could, that actually what Jesus is doing and saying and what Christianity actually is, if you go right back, is not in any way in conflict with what they believed, or well, maybe with some aspects of what they believe, but it's not. it's not what it's often represented as, which is this kind of sterile false story which takes the sting out of everything and is also opposed to myth and tradition and story and indigeneity and all these other things that people like you might like. There is, in some ways, yeah, there's a contradiction between traditional religions and Christianity, of course, but at the same time, there's something very wild and earthy about what's actually going on there.
Yes, I would completely agree. And from you could nuance what I'm about to say. You could finesse it, but from a distance, Christ has an extraordinarily shamanic sensibility. And what I mean by that is nothing to do with the New Age or tarot cards or any of that business. What I mean by it is the essence of shamanic experience is a wounded healer. And so as soon as the passion is revealed to an indigenous mind, they understand that this is a moment, or many of these they would respond writ large, because this is a creature through his suffering. There's an old these are just occurring to me now. There's an old Inuit story, Raven brings the light. Raven brings light from another place, and before that the world is in darkness. And I always see, and it goes back to me to the story of Elijah, when Elijah is actually out in the desert and God has warned him. He said, "There's a terrible times coming, but if you go out into the bush, I'll bring I'll bring you sustenance." And he waits and he waits and he waits, and to his horror, coming towards him are two enormous ravens. And the ravens bring the meat that keeps Elijah alive. Now, the ravens, in the context of that time, which is effectively Bronze Age, they are unclean birds. They are unclean birds. But I always see Christ as the great crow that comes and drinks the sin of the world, the unripeness of the world. And once it becomes explained to me like that, and that's a very kind of indigenous, storified way of doing it, the sheer power of it opens up again. It's like the end of the Narnia books when all the animals that are frozen come back to life. And what I'm trying to do, remember we'll talk about it in a bit, my work with the Merrie, as a
Mm.
response to the machine, and also a response to a very frozen form of religion that I think many of us have encountered and are restless with. Um, yeah, yeah.
Well, here's a question. I don't know if you can answer this or even if it's a question that makes sense, but I'm thinking as you speak, one of the many books I quoted and read in this book of mine is a book by Lewis Mumford called The Myth of the Machine, which is a really good, very old, from the 1960s now, but a very good analysis of what technological society is and what its way of seeing is. And he does see it as a myth. He sees this whole notion of the machine as a myth. In other words, as a founding story that has a set of kind of values and pointers in it, to which it seems to me a more human set of stories is actually opposed. And I just wonder, as a storyteller, when you look at the machine, if you like, or when you look at the culture that we live in, the one that has such trouble with the stuff that you're doing,
Mm.
what's the myth? What's the story that we're telling, you think, or what's the worst story we're telling, the thing that we've got most wrong? Because we grow up with all these stories and something's wrong with them.
Yeah, yeah. Would as is often the way for me, it's often not one essential story, it's a moment within a story. And one of the things that I do think about a lot at the moment is obviously when we were younger, say we're on a bus and we're going through a town, and if you saw a young fella looking into their lap at a bus shelter, you think, oh, he's thinking about his girlfriend. It's a moment of introspection. But now, of course, as soon as I see somebody looking down, I immediately assume that they're looking at their phone.
Mm.
And so what was actually an act of inwardness has now become an act of control. And when even our interiority has been invaded, the image that it brings to mind is Narcissus at the pool,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely transformed by their own reflection. Because especially when you are an adolescent, there's nothing more interesting in the world than what is going on with you. That is
Mm-hmm. Yes.
that's it.
Yeah.
And so the heartbreak for me is to come back. The machine is something that offers desire, but it offers desire, but it doesn't offer longing. Now, what do I mean by longing? it's probably not often that people put the word Rumi and C.S. Lewis in the same sentence. But in our family, I always grew up with the notion, the great totems in my family in many ways would be C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. C.S. Lewis was always saying, he was so wonderful. He was like, I love red beer. I love a pint. I love walking. I love my friends. But there's this other place. There's this other extraordinary place of which this world, which I am terribly attached to, is a hint of.
Mm.
And I think that that comes with the notion of longing. Now, longing, Rumi says this amazing thing. Rumi was a Persian poet, and he says, the experience of longing in your heart is God already speaking back to you. It is the return message. So, in other words, all that unrequited love, all of those teenage states are seen through the correct lens, the openings to religious experience. And I don't think the machine wants religious experience. I think what the machine wants to do is say, how quickly, Paul Kingsnorth, do you need that book about the Russian influence on Mount Athos? Because I can get it to you in 8 hours' time if you just
Mm.
press this button, or you go through actually having to. Actually, you and I have friends that just give us books for free all the time,
Oh,
which is
yeah.
keep it
Which is
coming.
good.
But you see what I'm saying? I'm just very very critical of the quick route. However, another thought about the machine for me, and I'm sure you address this, is a very old word you get in the Greek, but the pharmakon. It's the poison and the remedy. It would be obvious to anybody saying, well, it's all right for them to talk about the machine. What am I bloody watching this on? How are they in touch with each other? Huh, riddle me that. That's true. But actually, I think a healthy human life is, I think how you define a grown up is making a covenant with limit. It's making a covenant with limit. Blake always says, you never know when you've had enough till you've had more than enough. Well, for God's sake, and I mean that in the best sense, have we not had more than enough? Have we not? Is the evidence not writ large around us? So, ironically, for me, technology, I wrote a small book called Smoke Hole a few years ago. And the question in the book is a very simple question was how did a tool become a temple? How did a tool become a temple? And is there an intelligence at play that's put that into place that is bigger and more sinister than anything I can even imagine, which is probably kind of what partially the labors of your book.
Yeah, and I certainly have a suspicion that's exactly what's going on. I mean, it's interesting when you look at the whole progress of modernity from a spiritual perspective. Certainly from a Christian perspective, it looks quite different. And like you say, maybe if I had one definition of the machine, and just thinking about what you're saying here, it would be a mechanism for destroying limits. That's really
Yeah,
what it is. It's not so much about the individual technologies that exist, although they're a kind of manifestation of it. But technology is what humans do. We've always done that. That's actually in one way not the issue. The issue is what the value behind it is. The issue is what this thing is serving, and what
I
it
think, yeah,
what it makes us worship.
I think the machine is very clever because it pretends that it brings Pentecost, but it really brings Babel.
Hmm. Yeah,
It pretends that it brings
certainly
Pentecost,
doing
but
that.
it's really. So, in other words, as we know, what is Pentecost? Pentecost is that extraordinary moment, 50 days or so after the ascension, when suddenly we can all understand different languages. The presence of the Holy Spirit is near. For a moment, but actually, as you say it, we are probably as limitless in that environment, in the presence of the Holy Spirit. We are as limitless as human beings are actually meant to be. But I don't believe for a second that we have entered a kind of Pentecostal place. I believe we're in a place of Babel. And of course, we are building a tower to our own magnificence. And at the same time, we are soulfully more incoherent than ever, and we're more isolated than ever. And we don't understand what anybody is saying to us because we are going through, to paraphrase a book titled by Lewis, a great divorce. This has been one of my big polemics with myth, is that myth has gone from something that used to be writ all around us. Any indigenous person would say myth, soul is something that happens mostly outside of your body. Whereas now, at best, you sit there on your smartphone at 3 in the morning, all alone, scrolling Gilgamesh.
Mm.
It's gone from a universe that is ensouled, that is interested in you, a universe that is a contact sport, into a profound tranced inwardness where your longing for God has been thinned out to your longing for stuff to a point where you can barely remember. So it is a moment of peril.
I
Yeah.
think it's a wonderful way of putting it. So then the logical question becomes, what do we do about that? What does the mythologist have to tell us? Maybe this is the time when we talk about the Merrie, because I'm quite intrigued
Mm,
by this notion that you've recently put into words of this thing called
mm,
the Merrie, which it seems to me you're
yeah.
almost holding up as an opposition to or as an alternative to this kind of machine way of seeing. What is it? What are you talking about?
Well, first of all, I think probably to be a real person these days, we've got to become outlaws again.
Hmm.
And my favorite outlaws, without question, is Robin Hood, Maid Marian, and the Merry Men.
I think that's
They're
true for
just,
most of us.
they're so fantastic.
Hmm.
You rob from the rich, you give to the poor, you live in the forest, you share stuff, you tell stories. What's not to like? And
Flagons of ale as well. Flagons
yeah,
of
oh
ale.
yes, there's flagons of ale. There's a couple of religious instructors walking around. You know,
Yeah, that's right.
all is well.
Keeping on. Yeah.
All is
Not a very
all
well
is
behaved
well.
one, but
Yeah, yeah. So the merry is a word, and here's an interesting dilemma I have. I have I have become an Orthodox Christian, but I'm in a family that God has ordained to put me in a situation where my brother is an evangelical Christian. My sister is something called a charismatic Catholic. Most people don't even know that combination exists. And my mother and father are, you'd have to ask them. There would be a long term back. There would be a kind of Plymouth Brethren element through the Baptists and the house church movement into a some kind of relationship with the Church of England. But where the Church of England is at the moment, literally God only knows. So this is my point. The point is that I just have to be able to talk over the fence to other Christians, if you know what I mean. I can't just go to divine liturgy, go to my Orthodox church and come back. Now, the thing about Orthodox is, you know very well, you don't audition Orthodox for what you think. Orthodoxy auditions you.
hmm.
And it finds out as you're a catechumen if you're really going to be able to stick with this or not, because there are limits and there are places and things that you are not going to explore anymore. It's not massively, it's not available to everything. There are certain things I think Orthodox Christians would gently say are in error in the West, and they just are, and that's that. But on the other hand, one of Jesus's perennial messages, actually, he says this constantly: stop worrying. Will you
Hmm.
please, everybody, stop worrying?
Hmm.
I'm kind of into that. And Elder Thaddeus, who we both love, you know, that
Yeah,
incredible book of his, Our
wonderful book
Thoughts,
that. Yeah.
incredible, incredible. So, sorry, I'm going in a big roundabout way, but I'm
No,
leading
go
to the
ahead.
Mary. What I notice, what I notice with Catholics, what I notice with evangelicals, what I notice with Anglicans, what I certainly notice with Orthodox is there is a growing interest in a contemplative tradition. There's a growing interest in the saints. There's a growing interest in what happens when the universal message of Christ actually meets a location, as it has in Alaska. You've just got back from Alaska. What happens when a place based church starts to grow out of the very ground and doesn't just become rabid nationalism, becomes profound Christianity? I'm sure you and I have probably talked in the past about the lovely Ethiopian idea that a church should always be built with a forest around it.
Mm.
My little ad lib to that is the church would die of loneliness without a forest around it. But
Mm.
maybe the forest would die of loneliness as well.
I think,
I've
yeah. Well, I'll
I've
tell you
been
something about. Sorry, go on.
I've been writing recently about the notion of the nature of a church and the church of nature. Most of us have no problem with the church of nature. We
Mm.
love it.
Very
Mountains,
popular.
trees, sea. I feel good. Thank you. Bye bye. But when I go into a church, if I am struggling with something, interestingly, the environment of the church will intensify, not release me from my dilemma.
Mm.
So, in other words, the nature of a church does something different than the church in nature. And mercifully, I don't really have to choose between the two. You will remember the moment when the incredible moment. I'll never get past this moment with the woman at the well. And she
Mm.
says to Jesus, look, as a Samaritan, we worship on the mountain. Jews worship in Jerusalem. Which is it to be? And he's like, it's going to be everywhere now. It's going to be everywhere. So anyway, please butt in. Then I'll talk
No,
about the
I was
moment.
just going to talk about Alaska. I just came back from visiting Spruce Island, where St. Herman of Alaska had his cell. And one of the monks there took us on a walk through the forest, and beautiful spruce forest, lots of moss. But there is a very particular stillness around the cell of St. Herman and around where
Mm,
he's buried as well, which I've never experienced in another forest. And I thought when I got there, well, this is just what the forest is like here, but it isn't, because when you keep walking, the atmosphere changes and you just get back into what would normally feel like a forest. There's something really profound about it. And I talked to the monk about this, and he said everybody feels this when they come here. They don't have to be a Christian. Everybody feels it. He said it's the forest is still praying, and St. Herman is still here. And apparently, Metropolitan Callistos, where the English, well-known English Orthodox metropolitan, once wrote about that forest as being the only example he'd ever come across as of a sacred forest in the Christian tradition. So it's a very profound example. You could feel the prayers of St. Herman. You could feel this place praying back to him almost. Something was going
yeah.
on there that you didn't have to. I wasn't told about it before I got there, but it was profound. My daughter Leela was with me, and she felt it as well. Maybe this is an example of what you're talking about here,
It's
of
it,
when the spirit meets a place,
yeah.
that
That's
there's a profound impact there.
there are four things in this. I've written a long essay on the Merrie, and it would be wonderful if there was a way, anybody's reading this or watching it actually, just find it on Substack. You'll be
I'll
able
put
to
a
look.
link to
Yeah,
it because
I'd
it's
really
a bit of
appreciate
yeah.
that. There are four elements that now you've heard a bit of my backstory and Paul's, you'll understand why I'm placing them in the order that I do. One is the simple joy of rediscovering Christian stories. Now, that is also the kind of storytelling that Paul was just bringing up, oral storytelling, standing up and telling a story that, to be honest, is not chapter and verse, but is telling the story of Samson or the story of Naomi and Ruth or the story of the creation of things. There is an electrifying presence when you release those stories from their cages. So, number one is enjoying the voluptuousness and the angularness of the Christian message through myth, but not myth as a kind of, and that means it is a fable and not true, but a kind of, luminous present. Number one. Secondly, is what you've just touched, nature, the living earth. I have to say, when I read Genesis and that wonderful moment where God says it is very good, I think, well, this is pretty cool. This is a kind of an original church. This is like original church. I love it. And so I would recommend, I have to say, spending more time listening to the gospel of a cormorant or the gospel of an oak tree or the gospel of a mountain. Something I've been doing for the last 3 years is something called the Peregrini sit, where Christians come and sit with me and fast for 4 days alone out in the wild, but they have a kind of ongoing Christian narrative. They may take out the Jesus prayer with them for 4 days and nights, but one way or another, rehydrate yourself to the living world again. Thirdly, a word that you and I are now very familiar with, actually, liturgy. And the word liturgy, the etymology of it, is really connected to ordinary repetition. It's not like startling epiphanies, it's just something that you keep doing. But a divine liturgy on a Sunday, that is for us as Orthodox where heaven and earth meet. And so I think a lot of us have a longing for the notion of pilgrimage, a longing to know, well, who are the local saints of that hill and that church? What are the stories that are to be told again? We as Christians are not praying in isolation. We may experience solitude, but we shouldn't experience isolation, because the very earth around us is bristling with saints, a cloud of the fellas and the ladies, pushing us on and wishing us well. That is tremendously encouraging. Myth, nature, liturgy, and my final point, which again, I don't know about you, no one ever said this to me. The Christian journey at its core is essentially initiatory. And that love I've had of all of the for all these years of the severance threshold return motif in myth, that plays itself out in absolute fullness in the life of Jesus. And if it plays itself out in the life of Jesus, that means we as Christians are connected to an initiatory tradition. And that's the final part of the essay that I really want to emphasize home at home. I think about Jonah. You know, Jonah, people are always saying, I wish God would speak to me. But I get this all the time. I wish, oh, people say to me, it's so lovely. God's always speaking to you in King's North. He's always speaking to you in King's North. I'm like, well, I wish he did. I wish he'd speak a bit more often or be a bit clearer. But occasionally God does speak to us and he tells us to do the thing we don't want to do. And he tells it to Jonah, as we recall. And he gets chucked into a fish. And gradually he starts to get kind of regurgitated in the fish. And then finally he's spat out, but develops a beautiful prayer in the process. And I think part of the kind of collapse of Christianity in some regards in the West is we deserve it. We deserve it.
Mm,
And I think, as someone that's dealt with rites of passage for 30 years, we need to commit to the mastication. We need to commit to the chomp. And actually, I think we need to return to core, in the most beautiful, radical sense of the word, core Jesus values.
mm.
And
Very
that's really, and the merry is also, it has a bit of a twinkle. It doesn't mean grief can't exist in it, but it's saying that I concur with you. Absolutely, this is a time of the machine. But what do you and I, what our priests say to us is you never defeat the devil by paying it undue attention,
mm,
ever. You do the thing that infuriates it, which is you turn to the grace, you turn it
mm,
to the miraculous, you turn to the good. So the merry is an invitation for all of us in the face. It's like all myths begin tonally where your book is. It's
mm,
it's desperate,
mm.
and ironically, it is only when it is that austere a moment that something really miraculous can come forward. So that's a bit
No,
of
that's
my
great.
memory.
I think I quoted Joseph Campbell in the book at one point in which he talks about exactly what you've just said. He says, once you get to the point where everything is collapsing, the only thing you can do is allow yourself to be crucified and then be reborn. No
Yes.
point in trying to piece it back together. You can't go back to the past. You can't create the ideal future. You have to allow the resurrection, if you like, allow the death and the resurrection. So you have myth, nature, liturgy, and home. And those are
Myth, nature, liturgy, and initiation.
initiation.
And initiatory Christianity. Now,
Right.
I don't. In a way, there are other ways that all of these things could be phrased,
Mm,
but for me, like you, I'm trying to figure out in my tiny way, how can I help this wider conversation? How can I help this wider moment? And I've been puzzling over that for years now, last few years. And this thing, the Merry, feels like my bit of work that I
mm,
can do. And I can tell it'll be innately collaborative.
yeah.
It'll be innately collaborative. It's not, you and I have both we've had plenty of that already. You know
Mm,
what I mean, in our lives. And you get fed on that too much, you just end up into a word that both of us, we taunt ourselves with this phrase all the time, vainglory.
oh yeah, yeah, it's very true.
Vainglory. So how do we proceed, make the best of our gifts? How do we make a joyful noise to the Lord, not get subsumed in vainglory? And one of the ways for me that really helps is finding talents in others and telling, and raising that up. And I think the merry begins properly on Saturday, November the 15th, 2026, in Walsingham, where I will be keeper of the keys for a week at that lovely that Seraphine's chapel that you love and have
Yeah,
been to.
wonderful place that is.
I'll be there for a few days because part of that I'm going to be over in East Anglia a lot because of the Cambridge work. But on the 15th, I'm going to invite anybody who has any kind of interest in proper contemplative Christianity and the idea of the Mary to gather, and we'll have a little pilgrimage, and there's a lovely little village hall we'll hire, and we'll see what happens.
Mm, I think that is a wonderful place to end and indeed to begin.
Yes.
So thank you, Martin. It's been a really good conversation.
Yeah, loved it.
Really enjoyed it, and I will, as I say, point people to your work below this. And who
Oh,
knows, maybe we'll see you in November, and maybe some of the people watching this will as well.
good. And do keep an eye out for Literatures of the Wild coming in February.
There will be pointers towards all of this below this video, and I'm very much looking forward to that book. Actually, we have the same publisher,
We
so
do, and the same. I think we have the same editor as
we have the
well.
same publisher and the same editor. So therefore, it will be a book of extremely high quality again, just like mine, of course. Naturally, what a
Good.
wonderful note to end on. Some vainglory. Excellent. Thank you.
Spread the vainglory around.
Vainglory.
Amen.
Never have too much vainglory. Thank
No.
you, Martin. You're a star.
Thank you. You too, Paul.
Take care.
Good.